Just as there were disagreements on when the Cold War began, was it 1945 with the defeat of Germany? Was it 1947 with the articulation of the Truman Doctrine? How about 1949 with the creation of NATO? So just as there were debates on when the Cold War began, there were disagreements on when the Cold War ended. Was it 1989 with the opening of the Berlin Wall? How about 1990 with the reunification of Germany, whose division had been one of the principal triggers of the Cold War? 1991 with the demise of the Soviet Union. Pretty much everybody agreed that by the end of 1991, when the Soviet Union went out of business, the Cold War was over. But then the questioning started about, who won the Cold War? What did the victory mean? What was the cause of the victory? Most people agreed that the United States won the Cold War. If anybody had said, anytime from, let's say, 1949 to 1989, that at the end of the Cold War, one of the two superpowers was going to be out of existence, and they would have said that whichever one was still standing, that's the victor. So the United States was still in business, going as strong as ever in 1991. The Soviet Union no longer existed. Now, when I say the Soviet Union no longer existed, it's important to remember that the pieces of the Soviet Union still existed. So the 15 individual former Soviet socialist republics, that's what USSR was about, they were still around. They were independent countries, though. They weren't part of this larger federation. And Russia, still the largest of them, the one with the biggest clout, it controlled most of the weaponry. Some of the nuclear weapons had been staged in some of the Soviet Central Asian republics. But those republics wanted to get rid of them. They didn't particularly want them, and so they were carted from there to Russia. So Russia remained arguably a nuclear superpower, but it lacked the economic substance to really hold that position for very long. And Russia was in the state of crisis. So what was it anymore? Was it a communist country? Well, no, the communists have been pretty well discredited. Was it a capitalist country? Maybe. Maybe, in fact, there was kind of a post-Soviet going out of business sale in Russia, sale of government assets. In a socialist country, the most important means of production, as the Marxists used to call them, the big economic assets are owned by the government. But in the former Soviet Union, especially in Russia, the parts that had been owned by the government were quickly sold off. They were privatized. And so Russia developed something approaching a capitalist economy, but nobody knew exactly what that was. So anyway, pretty unarguably, the United States side won the Cold War. But what did that mean? What did winning consist of? Well, in the first place, it meant that there was no longer a contest between the United States and the Soviet Union as military powers. Earlier on, previous lectures, I said that the Cold War consisted of a geopolitical struggle and an ideological struggle, a geopolitical confrontation, that is the potential confrontation of armies and navies and so on, and the struggle between ideologies, between the philosophy of capitalism and the philosophy of communism. So geopolitically, the United States was as strong as ever, and it could throw American military power around in a way that it had been able to do for the previous 45 years, since 1945. Russia, the former Soviet Union, no, by no means anywhere near so much. It still had nuclear weapons, but the economic wherewithal to support a large conventional army, the ability, the willingness to project power beyond Russian borders, that had largely eroded. And it was the economic erosion that prompted Mikhail Gorbachev's series of reforms that eventually led to the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was no longer a military superpower. Again, it still had nuclear weapons, so it couldn't be ignored, it couldn't be scoffed at. But it didn't have the other kind of support necessary to make it anywhere near and equal with the United States in military terms. On the ideological side, the philosophical side, the contest between capitalism and communism, well, by 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was the principal proponent and basically the originator on the world stage of a communist country, is out of existence. And so the appeal of socialism as an organizing principle of government and of communism as one-party rule, the appeal of this to other countries was pretty much gone. And in fact, it got to the point where a philosophy emerged among some people that the struggle that had been going on between the individual and the collective ever since, well, from time immemorial, had been won. It had been won by, I'll call it sort of the liberal side, the side that invested importance in individual rights. And the liberal side, the American side, had won. And so some people said that this win was forever. And so there would no longer be that struggle. There was a school of thought that went so far as to say that history in any kind of meaningful way was over. Well, it wouldn't take long to show that that was not the case. But still, it looked as though on both counts, geopolitically and ideologically, the United States, the American side, had won. And it was a pretty good deal. Well, yeah, I guess it was a pretty good deal. It was a good deal in that the United States, Americans, no longer lived under the threat of nuclear destruction through most of the Cold War. Americans had to live with the idea, with the possibility that the Soviet Union, for one reason or another, calculation or accident or whatever, might launch a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. And that seemed to be pretty remote at this point. Again, they've got the nuclear weapons, and if you've got the nuclear weapons, conceivably you could use them, but they would have no incentive anywhere near like the incentive during the Cold War to even think about using them. So take away the nuclear threat, and that's a big deal. That's a big change. In other respects, there were a whole lot of people who thought that, hey, this is great. The United States has been spending billions, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars over the years on defense. Maybe we can turn that to other things. If we don't have to worry about the Soviet Union, then okay, we can take that money and we can use it on education. We can use it on healthcare. We can give it back to the taxpayers. So it was thought there was going to be this peace dividend. And okay, so it's going to be a win in that regard. So things looked really good for the United States, starting about 1990 and in through the early 1990s. Now, one of the things that quickly cropped up, however, made clear that the Cold War might be over. This ongoing existential struggle with the Soviet Union might no longer be in existence. Or at the very least, this struggle between the United States and maybe Russia would have had changed dramatically. But it didn't mean that peace was going to be the norm in the world forever. In fact, the Cold War wasn't even over by many people's estimate before trouble broke out in other parts of the world. Now, one of the things about trouble in other parts of the world during the Cold War was that the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, often had acted to moderate or maybe to put a lid on the violence, the challenge to the status quo that any two conflicting groups, whether countries or groups within a single country, would put the world system to. The United States and the Soviet Union during most of the Cold War were in favor of the status quo. They liked the status quo. They might like to change a little bit this way or the other, but for the most part, they were the top dogs, and they kind of liked the position they were in. So whenever a struggle broke out in the Middle East or in Central Africa or in Central America or Southeast Asia, there was an incentive for the United States and the Soviet Union to put a lid on things, to prevent it from getting out of control. It was as though the United States would police half the world and the Soviet Union would police the other half of the world. And the interests of the United States and the Soviet Union in this overall status quo would keep things in these other parts of the world from getting out of control. With the demise of the Soviet Union, the ability of the Soviet Union, the willingness of the Soviet Union to keep up that policeman role vanished. And so that lid over regional struggles seemed to be in danger. And this question of could anybody dampen these regional struggles became acute starting in the middle of 1990. Iraq had been in a diplomatic and economic dispute with neighboring Kuwait for some while. And this dispute arose out of the war between Iran and Iraq that lasted through most of the 1980s, started in 1980 and extended to 1988. And this war was one that had been really bloody. Millions of people had died. And it also put severe strains on the economies of Iran and Iraq. Now, the United States had gotten involved in this covertly, and that on Iran's side, and that gave rise to the Iran-Contra scandal, or at least half of it. But Iraq came out of the war, and it was on the verge of bankruptcy. So the Iraqis, Iraq is an Arab state, and the Iraqis looked to fellow Arabs, especially Arabs that had oil and had money that came from oil, to help underwrite their recovery. After all, the Iraqis said, we were fighting on behalf of the Arab people against those dastardly Iranians, the Persians. And so you ought to help us out. Well, Kuwait wasn't helping Iraq out as much as the government of Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, wanted. And so a dispute developed, and the dispute had other sources as well. There's a big oil field that lies under the border of Kuwait and Iraq. And Iraq claimed that Kuwait was pumping too much oil out of the oil field. And oil fields are such that if you pump from one side, you can drain the whole field. So the position of Iraq was that Kuwait was stealing oil that should have belonged to Iraq. The United States stayed on the sidelines of this diplomatic dispute, at least at first. And the American ambassador in Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, told Saddam Hussein that the United States did not make it its policy to get involved in disputes among Arab peoples and Arab countries. Well, this seemed to Saddam Hussein, at least with hindsight it seemed to, give him a green light to resolve the issue as he chose. And the route that Saddam Hussein chose was the use of military power. Kuwait is a very small country compared to Iraq, and its military is even smaller compared to Iraq's military, battle-tested in this long war against Iran. And so what Saddam Hussein did was, after blustering for a while and threatening Kuwait, hand over the money and stop pumping so much oil. If you don't give me satisfaction, dire consequences will ensue. Well, the dire consequences were that Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait, and in a relatively short time, as I say, Kuwait's a small country with not much of a military, within 48 hours, Iraq was in occupational control of Kuwait. And with the Iraqi army basically fastened upon Kuwait, Saddam Hussein could get what he wanted out of Kuwait. Now, this posed a challenge to the rest of the world. What's the rest of the world going to do about this? Is the rest of the world going to stand by while Iraq invades its neighbor, Kuwait? The two countries were not at war, and in the perspective of most people, this dispute between Iraq and Kuwait didn't rise to the level where Iraq really had any legitimate grounds for invading and taking over its neighbor. Now, most of the challenge, most of the responsibility for dealing with this challenge naturally fell upon the shoulders of the President of the United States, the elder George Bush. As I suggested earlier, had this happened 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier, the responsibility might actually have been apportioned out between the United States and the Soviet Union. Because in the Middle East, as in other parts of the world, the United States usually had its allies or client states, and the Soviet Union had its allies or client states. For example, in 1973, when Israel and Egypt went to war, the United States took the side of Israel, and the Soviet Union took the side of Egypt. And when things started getting really dicey, the United States and the Soviet Union basically could come to some kind of de facto agreement and then knock the heads of their proteges, of their clients, and calm things down. But in this case, there was no other superpower. So the world looked to George Bush. And George Bush looked to the United Nations. George Bush looked to the United Nations for a couple of reasons. One, the Cold War had been this thing that had paralyzed the United Nations almost since its founding in 1945. But the basic principle of the United Nations was collective security. And the idea of collective security, to remind you, is that the collective, the United Nations in this case, would threatened to punish aggression by one country against another country. And this threat to punish aggression usually would be sufficient to prevent the aggression. Because if the potential aggressor knew that if we attack our neighbor, then the whole United Nations will come down on us, then they won't do it. But it had been 45 years, well, 40 years, let's say. There was this important exception, but a very clear exception in the Korean War of the early 1950s. But in any event, the collective security principle had never really worked very well, certainly not for long, in the form of the United Nations because of the Cold War. But now the Cold War is over. And so the United Nations might be able to do what it was designed to do. So it was hoped by George Bush that the United Nations would be able to step in and perhaps punish Iraq, perhaps undo the Iraqi invasion, occupation of Kuwait, basically force Iraq out of Kuwait and restore the status quo. George Bush had long been a fan of the United Nations. He had also been the American representative, the American ambassador to the United Nations. So he had particular reason for hoping that the United Nations finally would be able to do what it was supposed to do from the beginning. A third reason is that Bush was president of the United States. The United States had just won its long struggle with the Soviet Union, and it wasn't really eager to go to war on its own behalf, on its own, at least without help. So Americans were thinking, okay, the end of the Cold War, well, the end of this wartime footing, the end of mobilization, the end of high spending on the military, and we'll be able to use this peace dividend for other purposes. So Bush didn't like the idea that Iraq could take over Kuwait. Didn't like the idea for one reason. The United States was having the most serious suspicions about Saddam Hussein at this point, who seemed to be a tyrant, and he seemed to be very ambitious and have grandiose ideas of what the role of Iraq ought to be in the Middle East. And by taking Kuwait's oil, all of a sudden Iraq was a larger player in world oil markets. And it wasn't just Kuwait. It was thought by many in the United States, including in the administration of George Bush, that the invasion of Kuwait was simply a sort of a test to see the resolve of the international community. What Saddam Hussein was thought to really have his eye on were the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, which are not far from the oil fields of Kuwait. And the thinking was that if the United States, or I should say the world community, the United Nations, does not take action to chastise Saddam Hussein, he will simply send his tanks rolling on into Saudi Arabia, at which point Saddam Hussein would be the huge player in the Middle East and in the oil markets. And this would give him inordinate power, and it would send all sorts of terrible signals to other potential aggressors. So almost from the moment when Bush got news that Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces had invaded Kuwait, he determined that, well, as he put it when he got off an airplane, and he said, this will not stand, this aggression by Iraq against Kuwait. So he was determined to undo the Iraq invasion, occupation of Kuwait. The only question was, or the principal question was, how's he going to undo it? Is it going to be by American force alone, or is he going to be able to do it in cooperation with other countries? The cooperation with other countries was his clear preference. He really didn't want to start up a war on his own. The United States had never gone to war on its own in the Middle East. And the United States was, there were still harsh memories in the United States of the war in Vietnam, which had ended in 1975, now it's 1990. So it wasn't that long ago. For people who were adults, they remembered it very well. And so Bush was not eager to send an American army into the Middle East. He was willing to use diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, willing to use the threat of American military force, but he really preferred to use the United Nations. Again, this would spread the cost, it would spread the responsibility, it would enhance the prestige of the United Nations, and Bush, as a real fan of the United Nations, wanted to see the United Nations thrive. As I say, it looked as though finally the United Nations could be able to do what the United Nations was supposed to have done from the very beginning. One other thing. With the demise of the Soviet Union, the value of America's anti-Soviet alliances was called into question. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, had been created in 1949 to counter the possibility to deter Soviet aggression against Western Europe or against American allies. And it was something that made a lot of sense as long as there was a Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, well, as of 1990, was about to go out of business. Everybody could see that the threat from the Soviet Union was nothing like it had been before. So would NATO have a future? Nobody knew. It might very well be that at the same time that Americans were about to declare victory in the Cold War, the members of NATO might declare victory, mission accomplished, now we'll all go home, and NATO would fall to pieces. So the United States, especially George Bush, who was really one of the canniest diplomatic presidents, canniest diplomats-in-chief in American history, he understood that as powerful as the United States was, every country wants allies. He didn't want the United States to have to enforce peace in a post-Cold War world all by itself. And he was really looking to the United Nations. It looked as though NATO might not be around much longer. So collective security, which had originally been this broad gauge thing, it was going to include potentially all countries, but then it became this sort of half-hearted thing with just the alliance, the NATO alliance against the Soviet Union. And I should point out that the Soviet Union had its own alliance system, the Warsaw Pact, and its alliance with China for a while, and so on. So even superpowers like allies. So Bush is looking for help. But the first thing that he did, after the Iraqi tanks and Iraqi troops went into Kuwait, the first thing that Bush did was to try to ascertain whether this was simply the first step toward a larger offensive. And Bush took strong action to make very clear to Saddam Hussein, the Iraq leader, that if Iraq or Iraqi forces threatened Saudi Arabia, then the United States would step right in. In fact, the United States repositioned its forces in Saudi Arabia itself, beefed up its presence in the Persian Gulf, the waterway that's just adjacent to Kuwait and to Saudi Arabia, so that the United States would be able to counter anything like this. And so it was made clear to Saddam Hussein from the beginning, from the invasion of Kuwait, that if he takes this farther, if he goes after the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, this will mean war with the United States. So you better not do it. In fact, that message seems to have gotten across. But then there was the question of, okay, so we've prevented further aggression. How do we undo the aggression that's already been done? How do we get Iraq out of Kuwait? Saddam Hussein probably thought that there would be complaints, there would be diplomatic protests, there might even be economic sanctions. But he figured that the United States did not consider it worth a war to get Iraq out of Kuwait. What is Kuwait to the United States? This presumably was his reasoning, especially after he got the signal, or at least this is the way he interpreted the signal, that the United States did not intervene in conflicts among the Arabs. Now, in fact, that may have prompted him to think that he could go after Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia was a huge player in world oil markets, and the United States by this time was very sensitive to world oil markets and wasn't going to let some rogue character like Saddam Hussein gain such a stranglehold over world oil supply, and with it the price of oil and all the stuff that goes with that. So very quickly Saddam Hussein was made to know you can't expand this, and now the United States is beginning to take steps to basically throw Saddam out of Kuwait. But how will it be done? Bush, as I said, was very much a fan of the United Nations. And so he began working through the United Nations. He began calling up people that he knew in other countries. I mentioned in an earlier lecture that Bush had known in earlier phases of his career people who were now leaders of other countries, and they were in earlier phases of the career. They're sort of grown up in world leadership positions together. So he could get on the phone to leaders of various countries and say, I need your help. The United States needs your help. The world needs your help. And he could make the case that we have an opportunity to create what he called a new world order. And it was a world order post-Cold War. The Cold War had prevented the creation of the world order that sort of all right-thinking people in American minds had hoped would emerge out of World War II. Okay, there was a long delay, the Cold War, but now it can take hold. And again, the basic principle is that aggression will not be tolerated. And if we can make an example out of Saddam Hussein, if we can undo his aggression, throw him back, punch him in the nose while we're doing it, then other potential aggressors will be deterred. And so this threat isn't something you have to carry out again and again. If you just demonstrate credibility, I've mentioned this in previous lectures, that credibility is something that superpowers, that organizations need to have. If they have it, then they don't have to use their power directly. It's the threat that gets the compliance. So, Bush worked long and hard. American diplomats worked long and hard to arrange the support of the United Nations for the ejection of Iraq from Kuwait, and specifically to get the support of the Security Council. As mentioned earlier, the Security Council had largely been paralyzed by the Cold War, by the difference in opinion between the United States and Britain and France, usually on one side, and the Soviet Union and China on the other side. And any one of those five permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, could veto any measure. And the Security Council is the serious decision-making body. The other half, the General Assembly, is where people talk. But the Security Council is where the big decisions are made. And big decisions usually could not be made during the Cold War. Now the Cold War is over. And with some arm twisting, with some incentivizing, the Bush administration got the Soviet Union to agree that it would not exercise its veto of actions by the Security Council. This was a huge change because, as I say, for nearly 40 years before this, the Soviet Union could be counted to veto anything that the United States wanted, just sort of out of the principles of opposition in this Cold War. But now the Security Council is going to be able to act, and the Security Council did act, and it passed a series of resolutions condemning the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and then saying that Iraq must evacuate Kuwait, and Kuwait must once again be allowed to exercise its sovereignty and independence. It was kind of hard to make a case for Kuwait as Kuwait, because Bush couldn't exactly say that Kuwait is this democracy that is being suppressed by this dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, because Kuwait wasn't a democracy, but actually, the principle didn't depend on the aggressed upon country being a democracy. The whole idea was sovereignty. You need to decide, every country needs to be able to decide how to govern its own affairs, and it shouldn't be bullied or pushed around by other countries. So, the UN Security Council says, yes, Iraq has to invade Kuwait. And so the pressure is tightened, and economic sanctions were placed upon Iraq. But Saddam Hussein seemed to be determined to stay in there. He probably thought, maybe, he certainly hoped, that this was all a big kerfuffle that would go away if he'd simply ignore it. If he'd just hold on, then he would be able to maintain Iraq's control over Kuwait. I should point out that Iraq had been saying for decades that Kuwait was really a renegade province of Iraq. It should have been part of Iraq from the very beginning. And so Saddam Hussein simply said that Iraq was simply restoring Iraq's control over Kuwait. Most of the rest of the world didn't buy this argument. The United Nations certainly didn't. The United States didn't. But anyway, Saddam Hussein hung on until the United Nations Security Council issued an ultimatum. You must be out of Kuwait by, I think it was January 15th, 1991. And if that hasn't happened, then the Security Council calls on all good member states of the United Nations to use military force to eject Iraq from Kuwait. The deadline came and went, and Iraq was still in Kuwait, at which point the United States led a coalition of UN forces. And it was important for American purposes that this be a coalition and not simply be just an American war. And the coalition launched an air war against Iraq, an air war against Iraq in Kuwait, Iraqi positions in Kuwait, an air war against Iraq in Iraq. The whole idea was to inflict sufficient punishment on Iraq that it would pull out. But the air war didn't do the job, and Iraqi troops were still there. So at the end of 5 weeks of an air war, George Bush gave the order for American troops, and with them Allied troops, troops of the UN coalition, to invade Kuwait. And the invasion took place, and it was quickly successful. The air war took 5 weeks. The ground operation took 5 days. Within 5 days, Iraqi troops were driven out of Kuwait. And the United States and the UN coalition had fulfilled the mandate of the Security Council to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. At that point, Bush was tempted to send American troops into the rest of Iraq and all the way to Baghdad, and to overthrow Saddam Hussein. It seemed as though, boy, that would be really the way to end this. Bush didn't do it. He didn't do it in part because he remembered what had happened back in the Korean War, when American troops had gone into North Korea and then brought China into the war. Well, China wasn't going to come into the war, and Russia was on America's side, but Bush understood that this would be a big deal. So he let the war lapse. Iraq was out of Kuwait. Kuwait was once again independent. The authority of the United Nations, the principle of collective security, had been vindicated. And that was that, at least for now.